Some men spend a lifetime chasing higher rank, while others earn something that no insignia can ever represent. The lunch rush had transformed the Naval Special Warfare Mess Hall into a steady chorus of conversations, clattering trays, and the familiar scent of fresh coffee and grilled sandwiches. Sunlight poured through wide windows overlooking the base, reflecting across polished floors and rows of neatly arranged tables filled with active-duty personnel. Sailors, instructors, and members of elite teams gathered between training schedules, enjoying one of the few quiet moments the day allowed. Near the entrance, an elderly white veteran stepped inside without drawing attention to himself. His name was Robert Mitchell. At 82 years old, he moved carefully with the help of a weathered oak cane that had clearly accompanied him for many years. He wore a navy blazer over a neatly pressed plaid shirt and khaki trousers. A faded navy cap rested comfortably on his silver hair, and stitched across its front was a simple rank that many people would barely notice. Robert paused for a moment, taking in the familiar sounds of military life. Although decades had passed since he last wore a uniform, something about the rhythm of the mess hall still felt like home. He smiled politely at a young sailor who held the door open for him before slowly making his way toward the serving line. Most people continued eating without paying him much attention, but one table near the center of the room quickly noticed the elderly visitor. Sitting there with several teammates was Lieutenant Ryan Carter, a 34-year-old Navy SEAL whose reputation for confidence had grown alongside an impressive career. Ryan possessed the sharp posture, disciplined appearance, and quiet pride expected of someone who had successfully completed one of the most demanding military training programs in the world. As Robert walked past the table, Ryan glanced toward the faded cap and immediately noticed the modest enlisted rank embroidered above its brim. A grin spread across his face before he leaned back in his chair. "That is it," he said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. Several heads turned in curiosity. Ryan looked directly at the elderly veteran. "You served all those years and never made it any higher?" A few younger operators exchanged amused looks. One of them chuckled softly before another joined in. Within seconds, quiet laughter drifted across the nearby tables. Robert stopped walking but did not turn immediately. He simply rested both hands upon the handle of his cane and allowed the laughter to fade naturally. His expression remained peaceful, almost thoughtful, as though he had heard similar questions many years before. Ryan mistook the silence for hesitation. "Do not worry," he continued with a confident smile. "We all have different careers. Some people are just not meant to lead." More laughter followed, though not everyone seemed comfortable joining it. Behind the serving counter, an older civilian cook named Harold Bennett paused while placing fresh bread onto a tray. His eyes remained fixed upon the elderly veteran. Something about the man's posture, his calm expression, and even the way he held his cane stirred a memory that Harold had not visited in decades. Robert slowly lifted his eyes toward the young SEAL. There was no anger in his face, no embarrassment, and no desire to argue. The noise throughout the mess hall seemed to soften as nearby conversations gradually disappeared. Every person waiting in line and every sailor seated nearby sensed that the room had quietly shifted. Ryan expected excuses. Others expected silence. Instead, the elderly veteran looked directly at the young officer with calm eyes that carried the weight of a lifetime and prepared to answer in a way that none of them would ever forget. Robert Mitchell continued looking calmly at Lieutenant Ryan Carter as the last traces of laughter faded into an uneasy silence. He neither hurried his answer nor searched for clever words. The patience in his expression carried the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove. Finally, he smiled faintly and spoke in a steady voice that reached far beyond the young officer standing before him. "Some ranks are chosen." The sentence contained only 3 words, yet it seemed to settle over the entire mess. All like a sudden change in the weather. Ryan frowned, expecting the elderly veteran to continue explaining himself, but Robert simply rested both hands upon the handle of his weathered oak cane once more. He offered nothing else. No defense, no excuses, no stories. The simplicity of the answer left Ryan visibly puzzled. "Chosen," he repeated with a skeptical laugh. That sounds like something people say when they did not get promoted. A few of the younger operators smiled uncertainly, but the laughter no longer spread across the room as it had only moments before. Instead, People began exchanging confused glances. The confidence that had fueled the teasing was quietly disappearing. Behind the serving counter, Harold Bennett stood perfectly still. The tray he had been preparing slipped slightly in his hands before he caught it against the edge of the counter. His eyes remained fixed on Robert. The veteran's voice, his posture, and especially those 3 words awakened a memory buried so deeply that Harold had almost forgotten it existed. Nearly 40 years earlier, while working temporary support during a Navy ceremony, he had overheard an older Master Chief describe one extraordinary sailor with exactly the same sentence. Some ranks are chosen. Harold had never forgotten the phrase because everyone in the room had immediately fallen silent after hearing it. His heartbeat quickened. He quietly removed the apron from around his waist and stepped toward the office telephone mounted near the kitchen entrance. The young sailors working beside him looked up in surprise. "Harold," one of them asked quietly, "where are you going?" Harold never took his eyes off Robert. "I need to make a call." He picked up the receiver with hands that had suddenly become unsteady. After a brief pause, he requested to speak with the Command Master Chief's office. While the connection was being transferred, he glanced back toward the dining area. Robert had already collected his lunch tray and was standing patiently, waiting for the line to move forward as though nothing unusual had happened. Ryan watched him carefully, still convinced the old man was hiding behind vague words rather than facts. Yet something about the veteran's complete lack of defensiveness began to unsettle him. Most people confronted publicly would argue, become embarrassed, or simply leave. Robert did none of those things. He behaved as though the opinions surrounding him carried no power over his peace of mind. Harold finally heard a familiar voice answer the telephone. He spoke quietly so no one nearby could overhear. "Master Chief, I believe there is someone here you need to see. His name is Robert Mitchell." The silence on the other end lasted several long seconds. Harold could hear only slow breathing before the Master Chief finally responded. "Did you say Robert Mitchell?" Harold answered immediately. "Yes, Master Chief." Another pause followed, longer than the first. Then the reply came with unmistakable urgency. "Do not let him leave. I am coming now." Harold slowly lowered the receiver and looked back toward the dining hall. Robert had just taken his seat alone near the windows, carrying himself with the same quiet dignity that had first caught Harold's attention. Ryan still believed he had won the exchange, but without realizing it, the room had already begun moving in a direction that none of the younger operators could yet understand. The atmosphere inside the mess hall continued to change in ways that few people could explain. The conversations that had filled the room only minutes earlier became scattered whispers, replaced by quiet glances that repeatedly drifted toward the elderly veteran sitting alone beside the wide windows. Robert Mitchell ate his lunch slowly, taking small bites without the slightest sign that anything unusual had happened. His weathered oak cane rested beside his chair, and every movement reflected the calm rhythm of a man who had learned long ago that dignity never needed an audience. Lieutenant Ryan Carter returned to his own table, but the confidence that had fueled his earlier remarks no longer felt as solid. He noticed that several teammates had stopped smiling. One operator quietly stirred his coffee while watching Robert from across the room. Another looked toward the kitchen entrance, where Harold Bennett remained standing. Instead of returning to work, Ryan leaned back and tried to laugh off the growing tension. "It is just an old sailor with a good line," he said. "People are acting like he used to command the whole Navy." No one answered. The silence felt heavier than any disagreement. A few moments later, the door near the administrative hallway opened, and Command Master Chief Samuel Donovan entered the mess hall with purposeful strides. His uniform was immaculate, his expression unusually serious. Conversation stopped almost immediately as sailors recognized one of the most respected senior enlisted leaders on the installation. Donovan normally visited the mess hall without ceremony, greeting sailors with easy smiles and relaxed conversation. Today was different. His eyes searched the room with quiet urgency until they found Robert seated by the windows. For a brief second, the Master Chief simply stood there. His face softened in a way that surprised everyone who knew him. Ryan noticed it immediately. This was not the expression of a senior leader recognizing a retired visitor. It looked more like profound respect. Without acknowledging anyone else, Donovan walked directly across the dining area. Every footstep seemed to draw more attention. Sailors stopped eating. Trays rested untouched on tables. Even the kitchen staff watched through the serving line windows. Ryan instinctively stood, expecting the Master Chief to address him after the earlier exchange. Instead, Donovan passed his table without a glance. When he reached Robert, he stopped beside the elderly veteran and smiled warmly. "Mr. Mitchell," he said quietly, "it has been far too many years." Robert looked up, studying the Master Chief's face for a moment before returning the smile. "Samuel Donovan," he replied. "You have more gray hair than I remember." A few sailors exchanged confused looks. Hearing one of the highest enlisted leaders on the base addressed simply by his first and last name was almost unimaginable. Donovan laughed softly. "That tends to happen with time." He extended both hands, and Robert accepted them. The handshake lasted only a moment, yet the respect within it spoke louder than any speech. Ryan stared in disbelief. He had expected the Master Chief to politely greet the elderly man. He had not expected familiarity. He had certainly not expected admiration. Donovan glanced toward Harold Bennett and offered a slight nod of appreciation before returning his attention to Robert. "I received a call the moment Harold recognized your name," he said. "I could not believe you were here until I saw you with my own eyes." Robert chuckled gently. "I was only looking for a quiet lunch." Donovan smiled, but there was unmistakable emotion behind his eyes. "Sir," he answered with complete sincerity, "there has never been anything ordinary about your presence." Around the room, curiosity replaced certainty. The young operators who had witnessed the exchange only minutes earlier no longer wondered whether Robert had once served. They had begun asking themselves a very different question. Who was this quiet old veteran that even the Command Master Chief greeted with a level of respect rarely shown to anyone, living or retired? Command Master Chief Samuel Donovan remained standing beside Robert Mitchell, seemingly unconcerned that the entire mess hall had fallen into complete silence. The usual sounds of silverware against plates and casual conversations had disappeared, replaced by the quiet hum of the air conditioning and the distant cry of seabirds drifting in from the waterfront outside. Sunlight reflected across the polished floor, casting long lines of light beneath the tables, while every pair of eyes remained fixed on the unlikely meeting unfolding near the windows. Robert motioned politely toward the empty chair across from him. "Sit down, Samuel. You have probably been working harder than you should." Donovan smiled with genuine warmth and accepted the invitation without hesitation. For many of the younger sailors watching, the simple act itself was astonishing. Senior enlisted leaders rarely interrupted their schedules to share lunch with retired visitors, especially without formal introductions. Ryan Carter watched every movement, searching for an explanation that still refused to appear. He quietly pushed his untouched tray aside and continued. Listening, Donovan looked across the table with unmistakable respect. "I have been hoping to see you again for years," he admitted. "Every Master Chief who came before me spoke your name with admiration, but most of us assumed you preferred staying out of the spotlight." Robert chuckled softly. That assumption was correct. Donovan nodded. It always was. The brief exchange only deepened the mystery surrounding the elderly veteran. None of the younger operators had ever heard Robert Mitchell's name during training lectures, leadership courses, or historical presentations. Ryan found himself replaying the old man's calm reply over and over in his mind. "Some ranks are chosen." What had sounded like an excuse only minutes earlier now carried an entirely different weight. Donovan glanced toward the faded rank embroidered on Robert's old Navy cap before looking back at him. "You never replaced it," he observed. Robert smiled. "It was never broken." Donovan lowered his eyes for a moment as though remembering something from many years ago. "Neither was your decision." Ryan could no longer remain seated. Curiosity overcame pride as he slowly approached the table. Several teammates followed a few steps behind, careful not to interrupt. Donovan noticed their presence immediately, but said nothing. Robert simply looked up with the same peaceful expression he had carried since entering the building. Ryan cleared his throat before speaking. "Master Chief, if I may ask, how do you know Mr. Mitchell?" Donovan studied the young officer for a brief moment before answering. His voice remained calm, but every word carried unmistakable authority. "I never served with Mr. Mitchell. I belong to a different generation. But every senior enlisted leader I have respected learned leadership from stories about him." Ryan blinked in surprise. Donovan continued. Those stories were never about medals. They were never about publicity. They were about choices. Robert quietly shook his head, almost embarrassed by the attention. People remember too much. Donovan smiled gently. No, sir. They remember exactly what matters. He reached into the inside pocket of his uniform and removed a small leather notebook that had clearly traveled with him for years. The edges were worn smooth from constant use. Opening it carefully, he turned several pages before stopping near the center. Folded inside was an old photocopy of a Navy personnel document. Donovan placed it gently on the table without saying a word. Robert recognized it immediately and gave a quiet sigh mixed with amusement. Ryan leaned forward just enough to see the page. The document contained several administrative entries spanning multiple years. The same handwritten notation appeared again and again beside different promotion recommendations. Decline promotion. Decline promotion. Decline promotion. Ryan stared silently at the repeated words, unable to understand why anyone would willingly refuse advancement more than once. Donovan closed the notebook and looked directly at the young officer. You asked earlier why a man would spend an entire career wearing the same modest rank, he said quietly. You assumed the Navy decided his future. The truth is far more remarkable. The Navy offered him more. He simply chose something he valued even higher. Ryan Carter kept his eyes fixed on the old personnel document resting on the table, reading the same handwritten words again and again as though they might suddenly change into something easier to understand. Decline promotion. The phrase appeared beside different dates separated by years, each recommendation carrying the signatures of commanding officers who had clearly believed Robert Mitchell deserved greater responsibility. Ryan finally looked up. You turned them down? He asked quietly. Robert folded his hands around the handle of his oak cane and offered a gentle smile. Every one of them. The answer settled heavily over the small group gathered around the table. One of the younger operators spoke before he could stop himself. Why would anyone do that? Robert looked out the window for a moment, watching a pair of sailors crossing the courtyard beneath an American flag moving softly in the afternoon breeze. His expression carried memories that words could never fully describe. Before he answered, Command Master Chief Samuel Donovan spoke. First, because some leadership cannot be measured by the insignia on a collar. He carefully opened the worn leather notebook once more and removed another aging sheet that had been preserved inside a clear protective sleeve. It was a copy of an evaluation summary written decades earlier by a commanding officer. Donovan did not read the entire document. Instead, he pointed to one sentence near the bottom. Recommended for immediate advancement. Member respectfully declined, stating his team needed continuity more than another stripe. Ryan stared silently. Donovan continued. That recommendation was not unusual. What was unusual was that he declined again. And again. Robert gave a quiet laugh. People kept asking. I kept giving the same answer. Ryan shook his head in disbelief. You could have become a senior leader. Robert nodded. Perhaps. You could have worn higher rank. Perhaps. You could have had more authority. Robert looked directly into the young officer's eyes, his calm expression never changing. Authority was never the reason I stayed. Those simple words carried more weight than any speech Ryan had heard during years of military training. Robert continued in the same steady voice. The men beside me trusted me because I knew them. I knew their strengths. I knew when one of them was carrying worries he never spoke about. I knew who needed encouragement and who needed silence. Every promotion would have placed another desk between us. I decided I belonged where I could still carry my share beside them. The surrounding sailors listened without moving. No one interrupted. Even the kitchen staff had quietly gathered near the serving line, drawn by a story they had never expected to hear during an ordinary lunch. Donovan carefully returned the documents to the notebook before speaking again. Every generation talks about leadership. Most people describe it with titles and responsibility. The generation before mine often described it with one name. Robert Mitchell. The words were not spoken dramatically. They were spoken as simple truth. Ryan lowered his eyes toward the faded rank stitched across the old Navy cap. Only an hour earlier he had seen it as evidence of an unremarkable career. Now it represented a deliberate sacrifice made repeatedly across decades. The insignia had never reflected a lack of opportunity. It reflected a lifetime of choosing people over personal advancement. Robert noticed the change in the young officer's expression and smiled kindly. Do not misunderstand me, Lieutenant. There is honor in accepting promotion. The Navy needs good leaders at every level. I simply believed my place was somewhere different. Ryan slowly nodded, unable to find the confident words that had come so easily before. For the first time since Robert had entered the mess hall, the young officer understood that the smallest insignia in the room might belong to the man who had quietly carried the greatest responsibility of them all. The realization spread across the mess hall with remarkable speed, not because anyone raised a voice, but because truth has a way of moving quietly through people who are willing to listen. Ryan Carter looked around and noticed that every conversation had ended. Sailors who had arrived only for lunch were now standing beside their tables, holding trays they had completely forgotten about. Some had quietly removed their caps. Others simply watched Robert Mitchell with thoughtful expressions that carried far more respect than curiosity. No one had been ordered to stop eating. No announcement had been made. The atmosphere had simply changed. Command Master Chief Samuel Donovan slowly rose from his chair. He did not address the room immediately. Instead, he looked first at Robert with genuine appreciation before turning toward the gathering of sailors and operators. There are many ways to measure a military career, he began calmly. Some people count promotions. Some count awards. Some count years of service. Those things all matter. But there is another measure that cannot be found in any personnel record. His eyes moved across the room until they rested on Ryan. It is the number of people who became better because one person chose to stand beside them instead of above them. No one spoke. Donovan continued. Mr. Mitchell never rejected leadership. He rejected leaving the people who depended on him. Every promotion he declined was another decision to remain where he believed he could serve others best. Ryan felt the weight of every word. He remembered the confidence with which he had laughed only a short time earlier. At that moment, it seemed impossible that the same afternoon could contain both that version of himself and the man now standing silently before Robert. Slowly, Ryan stepped forward. Every eye followed him, but he no longer noticed the attention. He stopped beside Robert's table and stood at attention for several seconds before speaking. His voice was steady, though noticeably quieter than before. Mr. Mitchell, I owe you an apology. Robert looked up with the same calm expression he had carried all day. Ryan continued, I judged your service by something I could see instead of something I had not earned the right to understand. I believed rank alone told a person's story. I was wrong. The words hung in the air without embarrassment or excuses. Robert studied the young officer for a brief moment before offering a warm smile. Lieutenant, every soldier, sailor, airman, Marine, Guardian, and Coast Guardsman spends part of life learning that lesson. Some learn it early. Some learn it later. What matters is that they learn it. Ryan nodded gratefully. Thank you for giving me that chance. Robert extended his hand. Ryan accepted it immediately. The handshake lasted only a moment. Yet everyone watching understood that something far greater than an apology had just taken place. Respect had replaced assumption. Character had overcome pride. Around the room, one sailor quietly stood at attention. Then another followed. Within seconds, every active duty service member inside the mess hall was standing. No commands echoed across the room. No protocol required the gesture. It happened naturally, one person at a time, until the entire hall stood in complete silence. Robert looked around with visible humility, almost uncomfortable receiving such attention. He slowly rose with the support of his weathered oak cane and gave a small nod to those gathered before him. Thank you, he said softly. Please enjoy your lunch before it gets cold. A gentle wave of laughter moved through the room, breaking the tension without diminishing the respect that now filled every corner of the hall. For Ryan Carter, the afternoon had become something far greater than an ordinary meal. It had become the day he finally understood that the strongest leaders are not always the ones who climb the highest, but often the ones who quietly choose to remain exactly where others need them most. As the sailors slowly returned to their seats, the mood inside the mess hall no longer resembled the ordinary lunch hour that had begun less than an hour earlier. Conversations resumed, but they were quieter now, filled with reflection rather than routine. Every glance toward Robert Mitchell carried genuine admiration instead of curiosity. He simply sat back down, finished the last few bites of his meal, and thanked the young sailor who quietly refilled his coffee without being asked. Robert accepted the fresh cup with the same gratitude he would have shown anyone, regardless of rank or position. Lieutenant Ryan Carter remained standing for another moment, still thinking about everything he had heard. The words from the old personnel records echoed through his mind. Decline promotion. Decline promotion. Decline promotion. For years he had believed that every military career naturally pointed toward the next insignia, the next responsibility, the next visible sign of success. Yet the man sitting only a few feet away had spent an entire lifetime proving that leadership could move in another direction altogether. Ryan reached toward the shoulder of his uniform and carefully removed the small morale patch that his SEAL team had designed after completing a demanding deployment together. It was not an official award. It carried no authority beyond the respect shared within his team. To Ryan, however, it represented trust that had been earned through sacrifice and commitment. Holding the patch in both hands, he stepped toward Robert once again. "Mr. Mitchell," he said quietly, "I know this is small compared to everything you have given, but I would be honored if you accepted this from me." Robert looked at the patch for several seconds before gently shaking his head with a warm smile. "Thank you, Lieutenant. That means more than you realize." Ryan hesitated. "Then please take it." Robert slowly raised his hand, not to accept the patch, but to close Ryan's fingers around it once more. "No," he said softly. "Keep it." Ryan looked confused. Robert continued with calm kindness. "One day a young sailor will stand where you stood today. He will believe that titles explain everything. When that day comes, I want you to remember this afternoon. Keep wearing that patch until you have shown someone else what leadership truly looks like. Then it will mean even more than it does today." Ryan lowered his eyes and slowly nodded. The lesson reached him more deeply than any formal leadership course he had ever attended. Command Master Chief Samuel Donovan smiled quietly from across the table. "That," he said, "is exactly why people still talk about him after all these years." Several younger operators standing nearby had remained silent throughout the exchange, listening carefully to every word. One finally spoke. "Sir, nobody ever taught us leadership like this." Donovan looked around the room before answering. "Because leadership is usually explained with manuals. Every once in a while, you are fortunate enough to see it living in front of you." Robert chuckled gently. "Do not make me sound larger than life, Samuel. I simply try to take care of people." Donovan nodded respectfully. "Exactly. That is why your story lasted longer than any promotion ever could." Harold Bennett stepped out from behind the serving counter carrying a small slice of homemade apple pie on a white plate. He placed it carefully in front of Robert with a smile. "Dessert is on the house today." Robert laughed warmly. "I came here expecting lunch. Instead, I received more kindness than I deserve." Harold shook his head. "No, sir. We are simply catching up on respect that should have been shown the moment you walked through that door." Around the room, several sailors quietly smiled. The tension that had once filled the mess hall had completely disappeared, replaced by something far more enduring. It was the shared understanding that real honor does not demand attention, and genuine leadership often leaves its deepest mark through ordinary moments that become unforgettable only after someone chooses humility over pride. The afternoon sun had begun to drift lower across the harbor, casting long bands of golden light through the wide windows of the mess hall. The room had gradually returned to its normal rhythm, yet something permanent had changed beneath the ordinary sounds of trays, quiet conversations, and coffee being poured. Every sailor present carried away more than a meal. They carried a lesson that no classroom could have delivered. Command Master Chief Samuel Donovan stood once more, drawing the attention of everyone nearby without raising his voice. He looked around the room before speaking slowly. Every generation inherits ships, equipment, and technology from the one before it. Those things matter. But the greatest inheritance has never been hardware. It has always been character. The sailors listened in complete silence. Donovan continued. "The Navy can teach procedures. It can teach tactics. It can teach discipline. But character is learned by watching people who quietly live it every single day." He turned toward Robert Mitchell with unmistakable respect. "Men like Mr. Mitchell remind us that leadership is not measured by how many people salute you. It is measured by how many people become better because you stood beside them." Robert lowered his eyes modestly, clearly uncomfortable hearing himself described that way. "Samuel," he said with a gentle smile, "you are giving me far too much credit." Donovan smiled back. "No, sir. I am finally giving you the credit that your generation rarely asked for." Reaching into his uniform pocket once again, Donovan removed a velvet presentation case no larger than the palm of his hand. He opened it carefully. Resting inside was a beautifully crafted Command Challenge coin bearing the crest of the Naval Special Warfare Community on one side and the command insignia on the other. The polished metal reflected the afternoon sunlight, sending a warm glow across the table. Several younger sailors recognized the coin. Immediately, it was reserved for rare occasions, presented only to individuals whose service had left an extraordinary impression upon the command. Donovan held the case toward Robert with both hands. "On behalf of every sailor who continues to benefit from the example you set, I would be honored if you would accept this." Robert remained quiet for several seconds. He looked at the coin before lifting his eyes toward Donovan. "You know I never cared much for keepsakes." Donovan nodded. "I know." Robert smiled softly. "Then why offer it?" Donovan answered without hesitation. "Because this one does not celebrate what you accomplished. It reminds us what we should become." A warm silence settled over the table. Robert finally accepted the case with both hands, studying the coin for a long moment before closing it carefully. "In that case," he said, "I will keep it, not because it belongs to me, but because one day it will remind someone else that service is never about collecting recognition." Ryan Carter watched the exchange with quiet admiration. He realized that every meaningful lesson he had learned that afternoon had been delivered without criticism, without humiliation, and without anyone trying to prove another person wrong. Robert had simply lived according to principles that spoke for themselves. Ryan turned toward the younger operators standing nearby. "Remember today," he said calmly. "Years from now, none of us will remember what was served for lunch. We will remember the man who taught us that rank can open doors, but character is what people remember after you leave the room." Several operators nodded in agreement. Harold Bennett smiled quietly behind the serving counter as he watched the younger sailors absorb every word. Outside, the American flag continued moving gently in the afternoon breeze, while inside the mess hall, respect had settled over the room with a quiet strength that no order could have created and no passage of time would ever erase. The afternoon was drawing to a close as Robert Mitchell slowly rose from his chair and adjusted the old Navy cap that had quietly carried a lifetime of memories. He picked up the velvet case containing the challenge coin, slipped it carefully into the inside pocket of his blazer, and reached for the weathered oak cane that had stood faithfully beside him throughout the day. There was nothing dramatic about the moment. No ceremony had been planned. No audience had been invited. Yet everyone inside the mess hall seemed to understand that they were witnessing the end of an experience that would remain with them for years to come. Robert looked around the room one last time. Young sailors stood beside seasoned leaders. Cooks stood beside instructors. Officers stood beside enlisted personnel. For a brief moment, rank no longer divided anyone. They were simply members of the same military family, connected by a lesson that none of them had expected to learn over lunch. Robert smiled warmly. "Thank you for your kindness," he said. "Take care of one another. That is always more important than taking care of your reputation." No one interrupted him. His words settled quietly into the room. Lieutenant Ryan Carter stepped forward and opened the door leading toward the bright afternoon sunlight. This time there was no trace of the confident young officer who had laughed at an unfamiliar rank only hours earlier. Instead, there stood a leader who had gained something impossible to earn through training alone. As Robert reached the doorway, Ryan instinctively came to attention and rendered a respectful salute. It was not performed because regulations required it. It was offered because respect had replaced assumption. Robert paused, looked at the young officer with quiet appreciation, and returned a small nod that somehow carried the warmth of an entire conversation. One by one, every sailor and every leader inside the mess hall followed Ryan's example. Without commands, without instructions, and without anyone seeking recognition, the room became perfectly still as dozens of service members stood in silent respect. Command Master Chief Samuel Donovan watched the scene with calm satisfaction before speaking just loudly enough for those nearby to hear. "Never forget this afternoon," he said. "Equipment grows old. Buildings are replaced. Uniforms change, but character remains the strongest tradition any generation can leave behind. His words lingered in the silence as Robert stepped outside into the fresh coastal air. The American flag moved gently above the base, stirred by a light breeze coming in from the water. Robert walked slowly across the sidewalk toward the modest pickup truck waiting in the parking lot. He did not look back immediately. There was no need. He had never lived his life searching for applause, and he was not about to begin now. Before opening the driver's door, he stopped for just a moment and glanced toward the mess hall windows. Through the glass, he could still see the silhouettes of young sailors returning to their tables, talking quietly among themselves, no longer about promotions or titles, but about service, humility, and the kind of leadership that remains long after names disappear from official records. Ryan watched until the old pickup quietly pulled away and disappeared beyond the entrance to the base. He reached into his pocket, touched the small morale patch that Robert had refused to accept, and smiled to himself. He finally understood why the old veteran had told him to keep it. Some reminders are meant to stay with the person who still has more to learn. Long after the parking lot became empty and the afternoon faded into evening, the lesson remained. The smallest insignia in the room had belonged to the man with the greatest influence, proving that honor is never measured by what rests upon a uniform, but by the lives quietly strengthened along the journey. Some men wear higher ranks. Others leave behind greater character.